I declare this meeting open. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to the 24th meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs of the House of Commons.
To continue its work on the operational security of the parliamentary precinct along Wellington and Spark Streets. For the first half of the meeting, I would like to welcome the following witnesses. We have the Honourable Vernon Darrell White, Senator, as well as former Chief of Police, Ottawa Service Police, Peter Slowly. So welcome to committee. We will provide you each up to 5 minutes for your opening comments. To you, Mr. Slowly.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Bonjour à tous et toutes.
Good morning, everyone.
I appreciate the invitation from the Procedure of House Affairs Standing Committee to participate in this important study because of my continuing commitment to this city, as well as my mission to help build a more safe, just, and inclusive society. In addition to my former role as the Chief of the Ottawa Police Service, I bring to this committee over 3 decades of private and public sector experience in the areas of security, policing, and justice, where I played lead roles in the planning and implementing of a variety of multi-jurisdictional and multi-agency operations. This includes 2 tours of duty in the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in Kosovo. I have previously participated in the Standing Committee for Public Safety and National Security regarding systemic racism in policing. I was a participant in the Prime Minister's Listening Circle regarding police reform, and I was the co-chair for Public Safety Canada's National Expert Committee on Countering Radicalization to Violence. The events relating to the Freedom Convoy represent a paradigm shift in the way that protests are organized, funded, executed, and responded to in Canada. The presentations by police and national security leaders that have been made at this and other standing committees studying the aspects of the Freedom Convoy events consistently indicate that this was an unprecedented national security crisis for which our institutions were not fully prepared. Despite this, Canada's national security agencies, police services, public institutions, elected officials, civic leaders, and regular Canadians worked together to successfully end this highly volatile national security crisis without any loss of life or serious injuries. Unfortunately, this crisis also exposed long-standing structural issues that now need to be formally assessed and effectively addressed to improve public safety for all Canadians. These structural issues need to repair, rebuild, rethink, and indeed reimagine aspects of how we manage these issues. The potential expansion of the parliamentary precinct boundaries being just one such example, which I turn to now. The parliamentary precinct covers roughly 2 square kilometres and represents the most visible, accessible, and politically critical public space in the country. The parliamentary precinct exists in the wider geographical, institutional, and legislative context of the National Capital Region, which includes a significant amount of critical infrastructure across rural, suburban, and urban communities in 2 provinces. The parliamentary precinct is Canada's most highly securitized area, with 6 different police agencies involved in serving and protecting the elected officials, public officials, residents, businesses, and visitors using the space daily. The 6 agencies are the Parliamentary Protective Services, the RCMP, the Ontario Provincial Police, the Sûreté de Québec, the Gatineau Police, and the Ottawa Police Service, which is designated by law as the police of jurisdiction in the City of Ottawa. These 6 NCR police agencies work primarily through 2 formal bodies, Intersect and the National Capital Region Command Centre. These bodies enable joint intelligence sharing, joint training exercises, joint event planning, integrated incident command operations, and after-action reviews, to name a few. With this larger context in mind, I draw the committee's attention to the following areas that, in my view, need to be carefully considered. First, crime prevention through environmental design. Consider changes to the parliamentary precinct's physical environment, including the boundaries, to improve security. This might include boundary changes, closing roads to create a pedestrian mall, installing bollards and other barriers to limit vehicular access. Second point, budget and resources. Consider increasing resources to Intersect and the National Capital Region Command Centre to enable the 6 NCR police agencies to continually improve their capacity to counter the ever-evolving threat environment, and this must include both physical and cyber-related security threats. Third and last, the police of jurisdiction issue. Consider potential changes to the jurisdictional and legislated mandates of the 6 NCR police agencies, while keeping in mind that such changes will be very difficult to achieve and will not alleviate all of the core issues of multi-agency, multi-jurisdiction operations. I encourage the committee in its important work, which will hopefully lead to other solutions needed to prevent and mitigate enabling threat factors that underpin the national security crisis we experienced earlier this year. These factors include social media disinformation campaigns, societal polarization, ideological extremism, and reduced public trust in our democratic institutions. I end my remarks by recognizing everyone who was impacted by this national crisis, especially Ottawa residents and business owners. I thank the civilian and sworn members of the Ottawa Police Service and those of our policing partners who were professional, ethical, and compassionate in their efforts to resolve the local events and the national crisis. I also thank my wife, children, family, friends, former colleagues, and community leaders, as well as the many Ottawans and Canadians who supported me during my tenure as Chief of Police of the Ottawa Police Service. I welcome any questions from committee members. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening comments. Senator White, I just want to start by apologizing. I should have come to you first for opening comments, but the floor is now yours.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the committee for inviting me here today. By way of introduction, I'm currently a senator representing the province of Ontario. I previously worked as the police chief of the Ottawa Police Service, the Durham Regional Police Service, and served with the RCMP for almost 25 years, leaving as an assistant commissioner. Of note, I've been the chair of the Senate Speaker's Advisory Committee on Security since 2015. Many people will speak to the importance of relationships between the various law enforcement security jurisdictions, and obviously, they are extremely important. In fact, it might be argued that with the National Capital Region sitting on the border of 2 provinces, as well as being the seat of the federal government, relationships and understanding jurisdictions are key to maintaining a law enforcement model that for those who work, live, and in case of some, play here. I've seen that others have spoken specifically to the challenges, and I would argue as well opportunities that come with that model and the structure that is currently in place in Ottawa. I'll speak directly to one area of concern that I believe we should consider in determining any expansion of the parliamentary precinct. The area of concern that has been raised multiple times in other forums, and here I believe as well, relates directly to the concerns that exist where vehicle access is, or at least has been permitted, on Wellington Street and the west side of Elgin Street, next to the War Memorial. Since the growth of the parliamentary precinct security following a shooting at the Memorial and on the Hill in 2014, there was a concerted effort to increase security of the precinct and the people who work and visit the precinct. There was as well at that time discussions about the potential for a catastrophic event on Wellington Street and what a post-blast would look like should someone decide that this was their goal. In relation to the direct security of the Hill, there have been many changes. As we all see, parliamentary precinct security and the RCMP should be commended for their work over the past 6 years. But the concern of the actual security of Wellington Street has seen little or no change. The stark reality is that a blast like that which was seen in Oklahoma City, where over 300 buildings were damaged or destroyed and 168 people killed, could very well happen here if we maintain a lax sense of security on Wellington Street and continue to allow vehicle access directly in front of precinct buildings and, as importantly, Langevin building. Many will argue that this occurred in the U.S., and it did, but the planning that was being forwarded by groups such as the Toronto 18 in 2006 had very similar planning, using vehicles to move forward on plot of bombing many places, including activity at Parliamentary Precinct. As long as vehicles have direct access to this location, we are at risk of large vehicles being used to deliver explosives, and as a result, we are at high risk for a catastrophic event occurring on Wellington Street. When considering security, we should always look at the design basis threat. And there have been many movements by Parliamentary Precinct, obviously, to combat the design basis threat that we face. However, when we consider design basis threat, our goal is to either alleviate or eliminate and counter that threat. I would argue the best method to immediately lessen the threat of such an event on Wellington Street is to remove all vehicle access from Wellington Street and the section of Elgin which moves along the side of Langevin, in allowing for a buffer zone to be pushed south, at least to Sparks and maybe beyond, it would have an immediate impact and reduce the gravity of that threat. There are many other reasons to recommend an expansion of the parliamentary precinct, but if for no other reason but to give control of the space we're discussing to those who have a direct responsibility for safety and security of the precinct, it would work. If you have any questions, I would look forward to them and happy to respond.
Thank you, Senator, for those opening comments. We'll now proceed to 6-minute rounds, and we will start with Mr. Macaulay, followed by Mr. Nakby, et puis Madame Gaudreau, suivi par Madame Blaine.
Then Madame Goudreau, followed by Ms. Blaney.
The Chair.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. And to our witnesses, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate Mr. Slowly. Thank you for many years of service. I had a cousin serve in peacekeeping there as well. Perhaps you ran into him. To the questions to Mr. Slowly, please. What support did the police service request from the federal government during the federal convoy protests? I'm aware of the request for the 1,800, but what other resources were requested?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. There were a wide-ranging number of conversations at one point on a daily basis for almost a full week, if not more, with a wide variety of deputy ministers and, in some cases, ministers. We literally covered
some specifics.
So literally everything was on the table in those discussions. We talked about the need for significantly more staffing, police officers in particular, and officers with particular skills. We talked about efforts around mediation, interlocutors that could be brought in to provide some level of discussion to reduce the volatility in the situation. There were discussions around the financing of the event, tow trucks, literally everything that we could think of to bring a safe and effective close to the events here in Ottawa and across the country were discussed.
And what was provided of those items that you'd asked for, the resources you asked for? What was actually provided to Ottawa Police?
Ultimately, the primary provision of resources were additional officers from provincial and federal agencies who coordinated municipal contributions as well. And that was the primary thing I was asking for, and it was the primary resource from the federal government. If you're referring specifically to the federal government, that was the primary resource that arrived during my tenure in office.
Through you, Madam Chair, did yourself or anyone in the OPS request the invocation of the Emergency Act?
I did not make that request. I'm not aware of anybody else in the Ottawa Police Service who did.
Okay. You had gone to public requesting, I think it was 1,800 officers or support people. I think it was on a Friday, and that was turned down. I think the quote was, the Prime Minister said you hadn't exhausted your tools and resources yet. Had you exhausted your tools and resources yet when you had made that request?
Through you, Chair, I thank you for the question. I'm not aware of any particular quotes attributed to any public official or elected official. Okay. I did ask for the 1,800 officers and including some civilians, as a request from my board. I presented that to my board chair, my then board chair, and the mayor, and they signed a document that was sent to provincial and federal governments requesting those resources specifically, along with other supports.
Okay. And through the chair, what was the response from the provincial and federal?
The immediate response verbally from both levels of government in the meetings that I was directly involved with was positive, and there were constructive efforts by both levels of government and other municipal agencies and their governments to provide those police officers and resources. It took time for them to arrive, and so that was our biggest challenge.
Had the resources been provided as requested, would you have been able to, or the Ottawa Police been able to clear the streets safely as was done, but without the invocation of the Act?
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I won't speak in conjecture, sir, but I think I understand the intent behind the question. The plan that was in place required at least 1,800 police officers. When those officers arrived, I had every confidence in the commanders and the tactical officers to put that plan to effect for a safe and effective resolution. That is what happened.
So it was the resources provided allowed Ottawa Police to clear the blockades, clear the protesters safely, securely, and not the act itself?
The scale of those resources and the other supports that were requested by us as an integrated operating command system and other levels of government all contributed, and I said that in my opening statement, Chair, through you, that this was literally a whole of Canada effort to resolve a national security crisis.
Through the chair, was there a request from Ottawa Police Services or the PPS to provide technical capacity for non-invasive, non-invasive checking, non-invasive review for explosive detection in the trucks that have been parked?
Through you, Chair, I made no such request. I won't speak for the Parliamentary Protective Services. There are others here in the room, I believe, who could do that. I'm not aware of any member of my service that made that request. We did have a large integrated intelligence operation process that was underway before the events transpired here in Ottawa and across the country. I can't say for certain whether or not such a discussion took place.
Were you aware if the PPS had requested?
I cannot speak for the PPS, sir. Thank you.
You were involved, obviously, with a lot of talks with the PPS and also the RCMP. Were you aware if the RCMP had provided such services or had done non-invasive checks, for lack of better words, for explosives?
Again, thank you, sir. Chair, through you, I'm not aware of any such request or any such acts.
Did it come up? Through the chair, did this issue come up at all in your high-level discussions in the coordination with RCMP and PPS?
There were a number of discussions, Chair, through you, a number of discussions around the overall intelligence capabilities from the national security levels down to municipal police agencies like me that had events taking place within their jurisdictions. But other than high-level discussions around the past, current, and future capabilities of intelligence to resolve the circumstances, I was never participating in any meeting or discussion where those specific items were raised.
My time's up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. We will now move to Mr. Nakvi, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I will be asking questions through you, and I want to thank both our witnesses for the public service and for being here today. Mr. Slowly, I will start with you through the chair, if I may. Can you speak to the kind of occupation that you saw that took place as a result of the protests? You spoke about how the nature of protests has changed, and perhaps the level of lawlessness that you and Ottawa Police Service was experiencing during this protest.
Chair, thank you. Through you to Mr. Nakvi, I appreciate the question. It's been probably the most overused but accurate word. It was unprecedented. It was unforeseen. That doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't have been predicted, but the totality of the intelligence, the totality of the experience within the Canadian policing and national security agencies had never seen and dealt with a demonstration, occupation, illegal actions of the nature in and around the events of the Freedom Convoy. I can tell you from my personal experience in over 30 years in policing, I had never experienced that, and I have been involved in major planned and unplanned incidents in this country, across this country, and internationally. The level of organization, the level of counterintelligence, the level of logistics, the level of planning, the level of financial resources, the level of commitment, individually and collective, was on a scale that I had not experienced. And as I said in my opening comments, through you, Chair, institutionally and nationally, we were unprepared for it. Locally, we were unprepared for it. That said, we pulled together locally through leadership of people like yourself. We pulled together nationally, and we're able to successfully resolve a national security crisis without loss of life or serious injury. There's a lot to learn from it, but there's a lot to give credit to every Canadian that was directly impacted and involved in the resolution.
Absolutely. Thank you. Through you, Chair. I recognize, and just thinking of the timelines, that the invocation of the Emergencies Act may be just in and around the time that you stepped down as the Chief of Ottawa Police, but I'm sure you've looked at the powers, the very targeted powers that were provided for under the Emergencies Act. In your experience, who was involved in the operation, do you feel that those were appropriate and targeted powers that was required to bring an end to the occupation that was taking place in Ottawa?
Thank you, Chair, through you to Mr. Nakvi. There is no doubt in my mind that efforts needed to come from across the policing, justice, and national security organizations in this country, and well beyond that. I expressed that numerous times. and I will continue to say this was a whole of society effort to address a national security crisis. The various invocations of emergencies at all three levels of government in relation to these events had in some material way benefits, primarily as the police of jurisdiction and the chief of police in Ottawa. My number one need was police resources, police officers with specific skill sets on a scale that had never been gathered before nationally to address this. That plus all the other efforts of private citizens, BIAs, not-for-profit sector, and three levels of government, including the invocation of the various emergencies and the private injunction, all contributed in some way to the success of resolving that national security crisis.
Thank you. To Senator White, through you, Chair, you've spoken about before and today around security around Wellington Street, and one of the key aspects that this committee is looking at is expanding the parliamentary precinct, which in my view goes hand in hand with keeping Wellington Street closed and making more pedestrian. Do you think that's the right direction that we need to move forward to ensure that the entire parliamentary precinct is secure not only for people who work here, but also the residents and small businesses in and around Parliamentary Precinct?
Thank you very much for the question, through you, Madam Chair. Absolutely, I think the way we can actually reduce the risk, in particular in front of Parliamentary Precinct, and I want to include in that Langevin building, which although is not part of Parliamentary Precinct, it is the office of the Prime Minister. I think it's a high-risk location. I think the fact that we've continued to allow large vehicles to travel that route has been a problem for us. In fact, in 2014, I spoke with City Council members as well as administration at City about the fact that I felt we should close it off after the shooting on the Hill. Their concern was around the bus service, and they did say that they would consider that once LRT was in place, which it is now in place. So I certainly think it would alleviate some of that threat, and I think as long as we don't do that, we have a continued risk in that location.
Very quickly, through you, Chair, to Mr. Slowly, do you concur with Senator White's assessment?
I do, and in my comments through you, Chair, there should be consideration of what I call crime prevention through environmental design. That includes boundary changes, bollards, and barriers. While I specifically reference vehicles, I think it just needs to be, in general, the control of the movement of people and things through the parliamentary precinct, given the security required for such an important area for Canadians.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
Excellent. Thank you both. Madame Goudreau.
Madame Goudreau, Madame Goudreau, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much to the witnesses. I will speak quietly, and I hope I won't lack the time. I have many questions, and so I've taken note of them, and I will use my documents. We heard witnesses earlier where we all found that there was a command post that was set up during the very first week when the convoy was here. So if we go back in time, I'd like to know, and Madam Chair, through you, I'm speaking to Mr. Slowly, on what date were you informed that a significant convoy was going to set up on Wellington Street?
Sure. You should excuse
I'm sorry.
almost all of your opening context and most of your
Ma
question.
question est, à quelle date vous...
My question was, on what date were you informed that the convoy was going to set up on Wellington Street?
I think I understand most of the question through you, Chair. I don't have the exact date. It was the week of February 13th when I think the formal announcement came out of British Columbia about a convoy that would be traveling. There was probably within 24 to 72 hours of that some sort of a briefing note that I would have received. At that time, we were actually dealing with the horrific death of multiple people in an explosion here in Ottawa, and that was my primary concern at that point. I started to receive material intelligence briefings from federal and provincial bodies during that week in the build-up to the arrival on the weekend of the 26th, 27th, 28th. but at no point were we given a full understanding of the totality of the threats and the volatility that we'd be experiencing over the subsequent weeks after that. Through you, Chair, I hope that answers the question, although
Okay.
I'm not sure if I got the translation correctly.
En
If
fait,
I can
le-
just
Oui.
pause the time. Mr. Slowly, you mentioned
Février.
February 13th. Did you mean January
Janvier.
13th?
Janvier.
January 13th.
Just to make sure we're on.
Again, just with the context, I came prepared to talk about this committee's mandate. I have not received the information I would need to review all of the dates and the times to be precise with that caveat.
And I actually appreciate that caveat because we actually are here in regards to the parliamentary precinct. There are questions that kind of relate into that world, so therefore sometimes it's not a clear line. So as you are comfortable, please do answer the questions that are being posed
Thank
of
you, Chair.
and we'll make it work. I will resume the time.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So, in fact, we're here to think about the security of parliamentarians and what we've been told through witnesses, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the opportunity to try and understand who was the first person to respond to the request. That is, I'm trying to ask myself if it was Parliamentary Protective Services who had the legitimacy to intervene on Wellington Street, or is it the Ottawa Police Service? I am trying to understand.
Beaucoup. Chair, through you. So the police of jurisdiction in any Ontario location under the Police Services Act is the primary service who has the responsibility for providing policing in all of its forms for that jurisdiction. The Ottawa Police Service, in every case of protests and planned, unplanned events, natural disasters that require police response, in every case, in Ottawa, the Ottawa Police Service is the primary agency, police agency of jurisdiction to lead the response. They are inevitably supported by a wide range, and in this case, the full extent of policing and national security agencies for an event as large and as complex as this one. So from CSIS to RCMP, yes to the Parliamentary Protective Services. I did say in my opening comments, and I'll repeat again for your excellent question, there are 6 primary police agencies, and they are supported and coordinated, collaborate through 2 primary entities for intelligence sharing, planning, and operations.
Je veux être sûr.
I want to be certain. We spoke about January 13th earlier. When we're aware that this is about to happen, when you spoke earlier about the whole preventive aspect that's important for you, the possible request for 1,800 people, I'm wondering how it's possible that nothing happened. We weren't ready upstream, even though you mentioned, and Madam Chair, that in fact this was something unique. But in terms of security, both for parliamentarians and civilians, I'm somewhat worried because in 2014 there were a great many lessons learned. We heard that through other witnesses. So how can I be reassured that on January 13th we were aware there was a command post set up with the 6 police services after these people set up their occupation? So did you receive some pressure or order to not act upstream?
Through you, Chair. And I suspect this may be one of those ones where I need to defer to Justice Rouleau's federal inquiry for the level of detail. I can only say in answer to your important question that you've asked, and I've said it in my opening statements, this was a paradigm shift in terms of demonstrations and national security events. It had not been experienced before by me. I'm not aware of anybody else who is a serving police chief or a national security commander that has experienced it. There was no opportunity for us to have a perfect response to the perfect storm that visited this city and other jurisdictions across this country. What we did as a policing community and as a national security community was rally quickly around the reality that this was a different beast. And we shared intelligence information. We collaborated and coordinated on a continuous basis until we had the right resources and the right combination of larger institutional supports to achieve a remarkable level of success with no loss of life and no serious injuries.
Je peux avoir une dernière question?
Do I have time for a final question? Thank you. What can I tell my constituents when we sense that indeed there was a command center after a week, but to prevent a future event that's unique? I mean, what can reassure us? Because there wasn't action taken when it needed to be done. And we have examples elsewhere where upstream there were barricades set up, for example, to prevent that these huge trucks could come in. So please reassure me, if, Madam Chair, through to Mr. Slody.
Thank you very much. And Chair, through you, again, excellent question. And I actually think you answered the question excellently yourself. Lessons learned, shared quickly amongst a broader community, in this case a policing community, allowed other jurisdictions to understand the full nature of the risk and the threat that had arrived in Ottawa prior to it arriving in those other jurisdictions. I also want to include Coutts, Alberta, because that was happening almost simultaneously as the convoy and the events surrounding it came to Ottawa. So there were two jurisdictions, the RCMP in Coutts, Alberta, and the Ottawa Police here in the nation's capital, that were able to, within hours, start to share information to other police agencies: Winnipeg, Windsor, Edmonton, Toronto, Quebec City. And they had the time and the intelligence understanding of the threat coming to do things differently and ultimately more successfully. The answer to your constituents is exactly that. We will never be prepared perfectly for these unique crises. What we must do is try to be as prepared as well as we can be, and then respond as quickly and as effectively after the storm breaks.
Ça va? Parfait. Et j'ai utilisé un
Thank you. And I added some more time for the second round.
à vous si
You have 6 minutes, Ms. Blaney.
Madam Chair, and I thank through you, of course, the witnesses for being here today. If I could come first to Mr. Soley. You have said repeatedly in your testimony today that you were unprepared and that this was something beyond anything that you could have imagined or that other sectors could have imagined. But my curiosity, especially as we're talking about expanding the precinct, is why was there not any indicators or plans or thoughts about blocking any part of that part before they arrived? If you could clarify that thought process.
Thank you for the question, Chair, through you. Just to clarify, there were a range of discussions and a range of elements in every plan, and there were multiple versions of the plan as we learned and went through the process around in various agencies around the blocking of routes in, around jurisdictions, around city cores, around critical infrastructure, including border crossings. All of that was part of the initial plan and in every other plan that I was privy to all the way through. So just to be clear about that, we did not, I think in answer to your real question, we did not have an intelligence threat assessment that said what arrived was going to be arriving, of the scale that it arrived with, that would require a full blockade of any portion of this city, including the downtown core, what we call the red zone.
So through you, Madam Chair, so there wasn't the appropriate intelligence. I hear what you're saying there. But is part of the challenge is the multi-jurisdiction area? Because I felt like listening to other testimony from other jurisdictions, because this is a very unique overlap area, it felt like there was a lot of miscommunication. And I know that there's articles out there that are talking about the breakdown of communications that have been tracked through emails between different departments. So, without that intelligence, was there that... I guess what I'm asking is what would be different if the precinct was expanded? Would it clarify some of those things? Would it allow for responsiveness to be different, more unique? Or now we just know better and we're going to do better?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, through you. That is the ultimate purpose of the study that this committee is undertaking. I've said in my presentation in principle that is an area that should be looked at. Reconsidering the legislative and jurisdictional mandates of particularly those 6 police agencies, I suggest it's going to be very difficult to change it substantially, and I'm certain that it will not alleviate all of the problems of communication, coordination, collaboration that happen, particularly in critical events like the one we are talking about. I have also suggested that there needs to be more resources to the central bodies that allow those 6 agencies in its current state with their current legislative mandates to be improved. Financial resources and human resources to intersect in the National Capital Region Command Center will help to prevent and mitigate some of what took place in those events that we've referred to over the course of today.
Through you again, Madam Chair, I'm wondering if Senator White has anything to add.
No, if I may, Madam Chair, I think Chief Slowly has identified the issues. And look, we're supposed to learn from these experiences. There are no two of the same. Ottawa would have, 250 protests and demonstrations a year, and not once did we see anything that came close to seeing what we saw in Ottawa with the convoy. So I don't think anybody could have accurately identified what was coming until it arrived. Certainly, I think, we've heard witnesses in the EDC, the Emergency Act hearings, particularly from the RCMP, about the gathering of intelligence, and I think they would probably identify that the amount of intelligence they had gathered was insufficient to actually tell other police or agencies what was coming as well. So I think there is a learning opportunity here. I think it's the reason other places handled it better. New Brunswick knew what was coming. They were able to deal with that situation, as was Quebec City, as was Toronto. You can look, I think that learning opportunity is something that shouldn't be lost here. The reality, though, none of that changes the fact that I think if we want to be better prepared, it actually means having a better structure of security for a parliamentary precinct. And that may mean changing what parliamentary precinct security looks like in the future. They're still not a police agency, regardless of the numbers or how much money we spend and how many tools we give them. They still don't have some of the, I would argue, assets that they need to do their job sufficiently.
So through you, Madam Chair, I'm going to come back to Mr. Slowly again. So what powers, when we look at this context of where we're at, what we've learned, what powers did your officers require that didn't already exist in order to deal with the occupation?
Thank you, Chair. Through you, again, I'll repeat from my principal presentation and other answers. For me, the number one thing as Chief of Police in Ottawa were resources. Just the order of magnitude, the Ottawa Police has roughly 1,200 officers. At any given time, 10 to 15, potentially 20% of them are not available for duty, and they're required to provide 24/7, 365 policing to the largest geographical municipality in Canada, the second largest in North America. When something that big comes to town that we've been talking about, I threw every single officer that I could at it while still trying to serve and protect the million people that call Ottawa home. And ultimately, it took 2,000 additional officers from across the country with specific skills, 2,000 officers, almost double the size of my regular staffing availability to bring the events just here in Ottawa to a conclusion. That is the order of magnitude.
And through you, Madam Chair, I've also read that there was an increased amount of absenteeism in the Ottawa Police during that time. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that, and was there any related cause to that increase of absenteeism? And did that actually have an impact on the capacity of the force to do the work that it needed to?
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I'm not aware of any particularly increased absenteeism. Like every sector of society, we were dealing with the fallout, the ongoing fallout of the global pandemic. Ottawa Police Service actually, I think, did a remarkable job in keeping their members healthy and well during that extended period. We, like every police service, were extremely worn out from years of resource struggles against exponentially increasing threats. And most of my officers worked, in some cases, 18, 20, 25 days in a row during that particular event in the coldest snap that this city has seen, sometimes minus 35 degrees during the daytime for the majority of it. I have every respect and every thanks to the members of my service and every other police service that came here and acted professionally, compassionately, and ethically.
Thank you. We will now move to Mr. Viss for up to 5 minutes, followed by Mrs. Romanato up to 5 minutes, and then we'll probably get a minute into Madame Goudreau, followed by a couple to Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll move very quickly with my questions to the witnesses today, just out of time constraint. Just following up on my colleague's commentary, Madam Chair, in questioning, through you, Madam Chair, Mr. Slowly, you've mentioned numerous times resources that resources were a big issue. You used to work in, through you, Madam Chair, I believe Mr. Soley used to work in Toronto. Is that correct?
Correct, sir.
Were you present during the, I believe it was the G7 or G20 protests?
Toronto hosted the G20 in 2010, yes.
Were there more than 18 to 2,000 police officers present in Toronto during those protests?
There were, I don't have the exact numbers, but there were on scale over the course of that period between Muskoka, Huntsville, probably 10,000 assets in and around that area.
So 10,000 assets. So it wasn't the existing laws it wasn't the existing laws in Canada that was preventing you from dealing with the situation. It was the use of resources that you were requesting from other levels of government that prevented you from doing the job you wanted to do at that time.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, just to clarify, and again, I've said it earlier on in a response, my priority as a chief of police in the jurisdiction here facing the brunt of that national security crisis was resources.
Yes, thank you.
1,800 that became 2,000, but it needed supports well beyond that. Okay. Resources that included accessing heavy tow trucks for the removal of large vehicles and other aspects that eventually came into the mix that allowed for the successful resolution. Okay.
Resources that I might probably consider were probably available when the G20 protest happened in Toronto.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, while I appreciate the attempt to draw a nexus between the scale and complexity of the G20 and other G7, G20 events that have taken place in Canada, I do not think that is a comparison worthy of the discussions we need to really prepare for these type of events going forward. I would suggest
Madam Chair.
January 6th in the United States, Washington, D.C. would be a closer aspect.
I appreciate those comments. Councillor McKenney wrote a letter on February 3rd that the federal government and the RCMP assume full operational control of Parliament Hill and the parliamentary precinct so that the Ottawa Police Services can be deployed into local neighbourhoods to restore peace and enforce our laws, something that is simply not happening at this time. Was that an accurate statement put forward by the councillor?
I appreciate what you've just read, Madam Chair, through you. I'm not aware of the statement, so I can't validate its accuracy. What I will say is, and it comes back again to your previous point, sir, thank you for the question. What I will say is we did not have enough resources to deal with the portions of the events taking place here in the police's jurisdiction that I was responsible for, and to provide proper, adequate, and effective police services to the City of Ottawa. I was asked that question explicitly by the former board chair, and I answered it in the same way. I do not have the resources, the capability to provide adequate and effective policing in the context of an event of the scale we're dealing with and our regular policing requirements.
That's very helpful. Thank you. The Canadian Police Association was in Ottawa a few weeks ago, and they're proposing right now as one of their key asks that the federal government organize a national summit that brings together key stakeholders, including representatives of police executives, frontline representatives, municipal and provincial officials responsible for public safety, and community-based organizations with experience in organizing public events to establish a clear framework to coordinate the response to protests and demonstrations. Given the comments already heard, Madam Chair, would the witnesses believe that that is a prudent step to take, and possibly legislation that would include some type of framework to help coordinate maybe a future unprecedented protest on the scale we saw? Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'll defer to my colleague Vern for first comment.
No, look, I don't disagree that we need to have greater dialogue about how we're going to handle these events, because I think this is the beginning, not the end. I think we'll have future events that we're unprepared for, and I think we better try to improve on that. And I think the RCMP needs to take a stronger role nationally in dealing with what I would argue, and the Chief has said, is a national security event. They're responsible for national security's law enforcement in this country. And I think they need to take a greater role.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was very helpful, Senator White. I have one more quick question. Through you, Madam Chair, Mr. Slowly mentioned environmental design. Would by removing cars from Wellington and maybe putting in a tramway be a good way to deal with some of the security issues you mentioned through environmental design versus the jurisdictional challenges that that were outlined in the opening remarks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, an excellent framing of the challenge that this committee has taken on. First of all, I would say be as open as you can to considering all the environmental changes that are available to you. I suspect that list will quickly narrow to a few. It has been my experience in 2 jurisdictions within this province that crime prevention through environmental design physical change is the low-hanging fruit that often has the biggest return on investment. And I've already, again, stated several times, legislative or jurisdictional change is the high-level fruit that is really hard to get that, very timely and consuming, and may not ultimately address the primary core issues that have been raised so far today to me.
Thank you. We will now go to Mrs. Romanado for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to, through you, thank the witnesses for being here today and for your service and your expertise. It's very helpful. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have said, but one area that has concerned me is the fact that Wellington is open to vehicular traffic, and you've both alluded to that. When we look back almost 30 years, Oklahoma City bombing, Pennsylvania Avenue has been closed in front of the White House to vehicular traffic. When I look online, I can find the Canada Day vehicle closures for all of Ottawa from 2019, and there was no possibility of a vehicle getting close to Parliament Hill, let alone parked, whether it be a truck or not. And Senator White, you mentioned that we didn't know what were in those trucks. Now, the Prime Minister's itinerary is very public. A truck parked on the corner of O'Connor and Wellington with explosives in it on a Wednesday at 2:30 would technically wipe out West Block, including all parliamentarians. So the question of whether or not Wellington should remain open to vehicular traffic, in my view, is not even a question. My question is more, how would transferring the jurisdiction of Wellington to PPS, the Parliamentary Protective Service, understand the unique nature of protecting the Senate building and all of the parliamentary buildings, including West Block, help alleviate and prevent this from happening again? If you could elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. An excellent question. I hope I answer it, but I'm going to frame it a little bit differently. No matter a boundary change is a boundary change. I think that's probably the least challenging aspect of what you're trying to study. Changing the jurisdiction is the problematic piece. Not impossible, but it's the challenging piece of what you're trying to tackle. No matter what you do to change the jurisdiction, you first have to find a legislative ability to do so. You're going to have to address the Attorney General and Solicitor General of Ontario to remove the Ottawa Police Service lawfully out of the Police Services Act. You have a former AG and SG sitting next to you, and he would understand the complexity of this. Assuming you could get through that barrier, you would then have to convince whatever the legislative authorities that created the Parliamentary Protective Services to allow them to become the full policing authority of jurisdiction. And that means everything from responding to mental health and addictions calls, to sexual assaults, to gang-related activities. It would require a level of scale of resources well beyond what even Senator White referred to earlier on as the necessities now for the current mandate. Then you'd have to start to trade off resources because the Police Service of Jurisdiction, Ottawa Police, currently has that within its resourcing capability. I would suggest under-resourced. So that's where the real complexity comes in around jurisdictional or mandate changes. Move the boundaries as far as you want. Shrink them, expand them. The jurisdictional and legislative mandates is where the real trick in the tail is. And again, at the end of that, no matter where you redraw those boundaries to, you're still going to have multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency challenges in large-scale crises of the ones that we saw. We could draw that boundary up to the 417. You're still going to have on the day challenges with communication, coordination, collaboration, levels of preparedness, intelligence gathering. None of those issues go away.
Thank you, and I'll cede the rest of my time to my colleague, Mr. Fergus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to my colleague, and thank you to the witnesses for coming forward. Two very quick questions. Senator White, for a long time you have been calling for changes to the boundary for the security reasons that you outlined in your in your discussions. It would seem to me, and I followed your work very closely on this, it would seem to me that every time there is a crisis on Parliament Hill over the years, and I've been around here for over 34 years, we always move in incremental pieces. Is the vision that you outlined, and frankly, the matter which is largely being mooted around this committee table, is it large enough to think further ahead for the things that we can't imagine, we can't predict?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, through you, and thanks for the question. Post-2014, there was a number of us who were meeting when the discussion was in the development of legislation regarding parliamentary precinct security. At that time, we looked at a number of models, including the Capitol Hill Police Service in Washington, D.C. as being a potential model, and a number of those were brought forward to the government of the day and not adopted. Instead, they adopted the expansion of PPS, which we see today, but a number of other areas, and my friend talked about crime prevention through environmental design, things like one access point for walking traffic to Parliament Hill. Today, you can walk in next to the canal, and come up in behind the West Block, and nobody even knows you're there unless the camera happens to pick you up, and certainly don't know what you're carrying in a backpack. So those things were recommended and never adopted because within 72 hours of that shooting, people wanted to get back to the way things were and making Parliament Hill accessible to everybody, and they misunderstand the difference between accessibility and security. You can be hard on the outside and soft on the inside, like an egg. From a security perspective, that's really what they should be looking at. So there's a whole group of other things beyond Wellington Street that I think need to be implemented, or at least considered, that have not been implemented, and I don't believe were given sufficient consideration.
Madam Chair, I heard the buzzer go off, but is there an opportunity to ask the Senator or to seek a comment from Mr. Slowly?
Briefly.
Same question.
Thank you. I won't repeat, and we'll try to build on the excellent response you got, Sir Chair, through you. There is a hyper-focus for a very legitimate reason on the large-scale event that just took place, and the trucks in particular. The day-to-day threat to this environment are edge weapons, small arms, objects that can be weaponized if they choose to be by individuals, and individuals who, unfortunately, increasingly are suffering from a range of emotional, psychological, and health-related issues that predominantly are things that victimize areas like this with regularity across the world. So I would echo the point. We really need to think about hardening and reducing access while still allowing charter rights freedoms for protest and gathering, et cetera. Incrementalism in policing in general, I have fought against for the majority of my career. We have an exponentially changed society. We have an exponentially changing threat environment. We have only really talked about physical here today, and I referenced in my presentation cyber, which could create far more mayhem than what we're talking about, even with an IED packed into the back of a truck. So I really believe that this is an opportunity to go well beyond potentially the original thinking and get into the realm of exponential and resist getting into the realm of incremental.
Thank you so much for that. Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Goudreau, one question, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I am really, really shocked and worried, Madam Chair. When my children ask me the question, what about prevention? When we're talking to specialists to see what we cannot see, and now I realize that there's always going to be something new. And how can we be prepared? I'm worried. So I say that outright. That's what I understand here. Having said that, I think that we are still establishing new ways of working, if there might be some command set up before an event. But I have a simple question. How is it that the Ottawa Police Service, Madam Chair, needed to respect regulations and rules when we know in advance that trucks are coming, holding bombs potentially, and they're not moving, and so there is the possibility of towing trucks away? How is it that it took so long to even set up a single command post and nothing happened? But my question is, what happened that we weren't able to act?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, through you. I appreciate a desire to share a greater sense of security within your family, certainly within your constituents and broader Canadians. I can assure you, though, that the characterizations you just laid out are not accurate. I am not aware of any intelligence that suggested that there were munitions and IEDs attached to any of the vehicles coming. I'm not aware of any of that, even as a case for any of the vehicles that were here. Albeit I was not a part of the final days of the events. There was a command post.
Mais Madame la Présidente,
But, Madam Chair, I'd really like him to answer why there were no fines handed out, for example. That's really what I want to know.
Chair, through you, again, this is unfortunately just inaccurate information. I think those details will be provided through the important study of Justice Rouleau, and I will agree to participate. However, I'm called to that inquiry or other standing committees, but unfortunately, these are not adequately informed positions.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, if I could just ask Mr. Soley, one of the things that you spoke about in your presentation was misinformation and the challenges that were in regard to that. And I did notice that eventually the Twitter account from the Ontario Police started to address misinformation directly. And I'm just wondering if that had any impact, and reflecting on what has happened, how is dealing with misinformation important, and what things could we do better in the future?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, an excellent question. And again, one that I hope this committee will really put its mind to. There is the physical threats, there are the cyber threats. I believe in the long term, the greater threat to security, safety in our democracy and within the parliamentary precinct will be around the level of trustworthiness that people have in our institutions, the level of trust they have in information that might come from a source like the Ottawa Police Service or the RCMP or the Parliamentary Protective Services. And right now, from the feedback that I've had from military, national security, and police agencies, that the inability for us to have a single source of truth, to have timely information that is consumed and believed and trusted and therefore acted upon, is one of the greatest national security threats, local threats that we're facing. So whatever efforts this committee and any other committee working on this can do around disinformation campaigns, particularly those that are started and furthered on social media and other digital platforms, will be critically important to the safety of Canadians.
Excellent. So on behalf of committee members, I do want to thank you, Senator White and Mr. Slowly, for your time here today. I will also say that sometimes additional thoughts might come to mind, or you might want to expand on the information you've shared. We would welcome that information for members through the clerk, so please do not hesitate. I hope you both keep well and safe, as well as your loved ones. With that, we will suspend and switch over to the second panel. Thank you. following community advocates. We have Chief Wendy Jocko, welcome, as well as Assistant Professor Indigenous Studies, Belden Coburn. With that, I'd like to welcome you both to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. And Chief, we will start with you, up to 5 minutes for your opening comments.
Miigwech, Chair. Anishinaabe akin ate awaso kikanawatichikan. This land where you're upon and the spot where you sit now is the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. The Anishinaabe Algonquin people are one heart and one soul and have lived for thousands of years on this unsurrendered territory. We thank and honor the land. We acknowledge the enduring presence of all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people who call Algonquin territory their home, along with other nations. We acknowledge all the residential school survivors and children who never made it home. We acknowledge the survivors and all they have endured. We honor the important contributions of all veterans in the service to Canada, and we remember those who lost their lives and those whose lives were forever changed. I would like to begin by thanking the committee for inviting me to discuss expanding the parliamentary precinct to include sections of Wellington Street and Spark Street. On October 22, 2014, a man evaded security and entered the Hall of Honor with a rifle and a knife after fatally shooting Corporal Nathan Cirillo of the Argyll and the Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, threatening the very lives of parliamentarians and personnel at the Hill. Before he was stopped, he injured a constable. That day, it was as if the very democratic principles of our country was under attack. Our country was unified then in its condemnation of this heinous act, vowing never again. On November 2014, the Joint Advisory Working Group on Security identified lack of communication among security groups at Parliament Hill as a significant problem and recommended combining the existing security forces under the Senate, the House of Commons, and RCMP detachment in charge of the grounds into one integrated security service. Parliament subsequently passed Bill C-51, the Anti-Terrorism Act 2015, which, among other things, amalgamated the Senate Protective Service, House of Commons Security Services, and Parliament's RCMP detachment into the Parliamentary Protective Service. In late January to mid-February of 2022, demonstrators occupied the downtown core of Ottawa, including much of the parliamentary precinct. The Ottawa Police Service acted as the lead agency with a number of other agencies from across Canada, providing support. The Parliamentary Protective Service was responsible for security at Parliament Hill and the Senate Building of Canada. The polite, some would say even mild-mannered police response to the blockade of the downtown Ottawa by thousands of protesters revealed to Indigenous people a double standard in how law enforcement agencies treat civil disobedience. Had Indigenous activists made the same threats, broke the same laws, and engaged in the same level of disruption, history has shown that they would probably have been met with a very heavy-handed crackdown. To some, it leaves little doubt that there was racism involved. Many have asked why people were allowed to threaten the life of the Prime Minister, especially after the promises made after the death of Corporal Nathan Cirillo. While there was some in the group who claimed to be Indigenous, they did not respect the protocols of the Algonquin Nation in respecting ceremony, and we were asked by the rights holders of the chiefs of Pikwakanagan, Kitikan Sibi, and the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council to respect our territory and customs to no avail. We wondered about that because there was an Indigenous person If that were an Indigenous person, they would most certainly be sitting in jail. Social media users shared images of flags bearing icons of fascism, white supremacy, and hate, including Nazi swastika and Confederate flags that garnered shock, horror, and outrage. My own father and mother, both military veterans of the Second World War, would have been saddened by the presence of these deplorable symbols of hate. Video also circulated showing demonstrators appropriating First Nation drumming as they danced, drank beer, and chanted yabba dabba doo and nonsense while shouting obscenities to the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. The drum is a sacred ceremonial item whose handling is governed by specific cultural protocols. These episodes happened only steps away from the Centennial Flame, where throughout the summer stood a memorial to residential school victims. It was an absolute insult.
Chief?
I must repeat, yes?
If you could summarize, finish up your comments, that would be great.
Okay. The parliamentary precinct currently includes the buildings on the grounds and on the around Parliament Hill. The area covers the 3 city blocks on the south side of Wellington Street between Elgin Street and Bank Street and along the north side of Sparks Street. The expansion of the parliamentary precinct to include sections of Wellington Street and Sparks Street to ensure another unlawful occupation does not occur in the downtown core again will allow more robust safety protocols to be put in place and should definitely be re-evaluated. However, this does raise some questions. We understand that the extending of the Parliament District to include what I've just described will have a potential effect on the Algonquin building that has been promised to our nation. And while in principle we may wish to support the extension of the zone, we need to ensure that the spirit of this promise is maintained. So therefore, clarity around how this extension will affect this promise needs to be unpacked. So
Thank you.
I guess I can end there.
Okay, great. And we can also share around your opening comments as well, and we'll make sure they're translated, and we'll have time for questions and comments. So thank you for that. Mr. Coburn, up to 5 minutes for you.
Thank you and good afternoon. I won't restate as much as Mike, who I'm grateful, who is quite eloquent and underscored her services to the nation in the military, and those from the Algonquin Nation who did likewise, including my grandfather. I've had 2 grandfathers that served in the military, as well as my father. In any case, my point today that I would like to register with the parliamentary committee today, and some of it has been alluded to by Chief Jocko, was that yes, although we use the words traditional Algonquin territory, we are the rights holders. We still maintain that because it is unceded. What it means that the territory is unmodified in our Section 35 Treaty and Aboriginal rights. We do have the Aboriginal rights. They are recognized and affirmed in the Constitution, although the treaty rights are under the negotiations of the current modern treaty process in Ontario, which have been underway for 30 years now, since the early 1990s, accepted by the Crown and Right of Canada and the Crown and Right of the Province of Ontario. My point here to impress upon you is to consider when expanding the parliamentary precinct to, I guess, enforce, is it must consider what Chief Jocko alluded to, is that there are considerations of access and mobility that are still Algonquin rights through the particular area that should be upheld, which were infringed upon by those protesting. One point is the Indigenous people space, of which the Algonquin Nation, through an agreement with then Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett back in July 2019, lies at across the street from Parliament Hill at 100 Wellington Street. But access and mobility as an Algonquin right for the area also includes our access through Wellington Street to make our ways to what we know is in the Algonquin as Akikojuan and Akipotuk, which is known sort of as the Chaudière Islands, is a very sacred site. Our access to that and mobility through there was considerably constrained by the protesters and the convoy. Now, I am respectful that the right to protest comes as an individual right under the Charter, but also we might have to consider the balancing of Charter rights against our Section 35 Aboriginal rights of access and mobility. So I would close very quickly with these concise words, is that not only is that a question, but what Chief Jocko alluded to is oftentimes when Algonquins with non-Indigenous peoples, but also other Indigenous nations that are here in the seat of federal power in Ottawa, our Indigenous protests are typically quite peaceful, but we're met with considerable police presence on the other hand. So while our marches may go through the downtown core, down through Wellington Street, past Parliament, it may be very transitory in nature. It wasn't an occupation of which entailed all the sort of despicable and unseemly behavior that was enumerated by Chief Jocko, which I might add was reports of defecation and urination. So I'd be happy to talk further again about what the Crown Indigenous relations entail between us and the Algonquin Nation as we make our way towards the modern treaty, in which Chief Jocko is an Algonquin negotiation representative and might be able to fill you in a little bit more. So as we seek to, under the comprehensive claims policy, certainty around our treaty rights in this particular region, which entails Parliamentary Hill or Parliament Hill and the parliamentary precinct. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. We will now proceed to 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Macaulay, followed by Mr. Fergus, Madame Goudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Macaulay, up to 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you, through you, Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for the feedback and the information. Professor Coburn, I'd like to chat with you. You chatted about access to the Chaudière Islands. I'm more interested going forward of any of the plans that have been put forward for the changes in the precinct. We see the transit loop. Realizing that what happened in January and February, as difficult it was for a lot of constituents and folks, was generally what hopefully is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, that we should not take away all access to everything based on perhaps what looks to be policing and city failure. But going forward, like how do we maintain? Like, what are your thoughts on the plans that have been publicized so far? Has your community been brought in enough, discussed enough, consulted with enough about access to Chaudière and in other areas?
I don't believe so. Otherwise, so I'm a citizen of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan, and Chief Jocko is my chief on Chief and Council, and she represents one of the chiefs of.
Great, because she was getting that. She was getting that as a follow-up question. So that works out. And Chief Jocko is very good about reaching out to the citizenship for consultations, and we would have received information packages. We received them weekly for information that Chief and Council seek input on. So we have. I don't believe I have. So I would defer to her, but as a citizen, normally, no, I haven't. Not from any of the authorities themselves. From our nation. So, and through the chair, it's kind of a continuation. I'd like to hear feedback on what does the community think of the proposed changes. We've seen everything from the Alexandra Bridge being reused, torn down, repurposed, a loop, pedestrian street. I'd like to hear what the community thinks of those proposed changes, if the community has been involved in any consultations and given any feedbacks, and any of the proposed goals, like what are your top goals of the community and what are the absolute no-goes, like do not go down that path, it will not be acceptable to us. I'll give you the rest of my time just to hear feedback and what your thoughts are. Yes, from both, please. And Chief Jocko, jump in if it's more relevant to yourself as being on the council.
I might defer to our political leadership right now, but I'm happy to provide any kind of information on, say, the historical importance of various sites around the area as well.
Like a go-forward basis, that we don't end up 2 years from now making all these plans and, oh, hey, we forgot to ask this community. So I'm just curious right now, like, again, we've heard of the transit loop shutting down Wellington, expanding police services. Has your community been consulted, and what are your thoughts on what we should do for this area, and what are the absolute no goals you cannot go forward with that from your point of view?
I think a little bit more of an extensive consultation with the wider Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So Chief Jocko and her council, as well as the, because despite this being in Ontario and we're the only status First Nation of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation in Ontario, is that there are 9 others in Quebec where title is vested in the nation. So they would have to be consulted, I believe, but they are also represented by more of a conglomerate sort of federation through the Algonquin Nation Tribal Council. So they have a larger a body that could join in the consultations.
Jocko, would you weigh in then?
Yes, I believe I did mention in my opening statement, just as Professor Colborne has mentioned, that the Algonquin Nation is one heart and one soul. So we are, in constant communique, on various issues. And we do, at Pikwakanagan, we do have our own consultation department. So any consultation of any description certainly does come through, including, as you mentioned, certain projects within the city of Ottawa. So we are aware of, certain activities that go on. We are consulted, and it doesn't necessarily get filtered down to the membership, but on various occasions, we do get reports that, we do have elders that sit on certain committees, as well as youth and other members of the community.
Jocko, just through the chair, do you have any feedback on any of the proposals that have been discussed or put forward so far? Again, the transit loop, shutting down Wellington, we heard how it could perhaps affect access to Chaudière Islands. Do you have feedback on that?
Yes, I do. Well, I don't live in Ottawa. I live in Pikwakanagan, so I visit Ottawa from time to time, quite aware of the district. And, obviously the expansion of the parliamentary district, it's going to have more than just security implications as we look forward. But
that's what I'm trying to get at, the non-security.
Yeah.
It's just what does your community think? Have you been consulted? Do you have any feedback on it right now?
Well, no, I have not been consulted. I was just basically asked to participate in this witness appearance, and that's just, the only consult. Well, we weren't consulted in any way.
Okay, I'll see the rest of my time. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now we will move to Mr. Fergus, up to 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I would also, first of all, like to recognize that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As the member for Hull-Aylmer, I'm always well aware of this fact. And I would like to ask a question, if possible, to Chief Jocko. I very much appreciated your testimony this morning, and I would just like to know, Ms. Jocko, Chief Jocko, given that we are reviewing the parliamentary precinct in order to avoid what we all suffered with this illegal occupation earlier this winter. I would just like to know, in your opinion, what should be the aspects from the Indigenous perspective, particularly that of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. What files should we really be paying attention to when we consider the expansion of the parliamentary precinct to improve security? So how can we do this while fully respecting Indigenous peoples and to ensure that what we develop will be done in partnership with you?
I did miss a little bit of the conversation because my translation was not on. However, I did catch the latter part of your comments and question, and I would say that we would like to be part of the discussion going forward, not to be excluded from those discussions, if that captures your question.
Merci pour cette.
Thank you for that brief answer. That still has many consequences. It's greatly appreciated. Professor Coburn, I ask the same question of you. What, in your opinion, would be the indigenous aspect that we should ensure that we adopt in order that we consider the expansion of the parliamentary precinct to increase security, not only of the precinct, but for all Canadians who visit the site, including, of course, Indigenous peoples?
Monsieur,
Thank you very much.
I believe that the Algonquins are very amenable, and quite a few projects have been advanced across the city of Ottawa. So working with the municipality and the provinces, I know Chief Jocko's worked on that quite a bit. So it's not that we would hold up things, it's that, and we don't have an expansive reach that we would impose an unduly burdensome requests upon Canada or the federal government itself to undertake the measures that it would be. But I believe there is the obligation to reach out to each of I think the 10 Algonquin nations and including the tribal council itself for a response to be involved going forward. So I just heard that nothing has passed through us, otherwise through our consultation department. I would have received something long ago. We do receive them quite often and quite frequently. So our administration of our First Nation under Chief Jocko is quite on the ball. As soon as we get something, it comes out through the mail, information packages for our input. So as of yet, we've yet to see anything whatsoever, but I would definitely welcome it, and you would see some feedback. It's again, I don't think anything would be unduly burdensome. To the extent, I think the point that I'd still underscore and restate for this purpose here is there are a few sites of which we would still ask for compliance and enforcement of our access and mobility. That would be the Algonquin Nations building at 100 Wellington, as well as movement through. I know that perhaps under emergency measures, your business as carried out by Parliament can be relocated. However, these particular sites, the significance for us, it can't be done the same as well. But they're not very large. But again, I'm also cognizant of the fact that there is a charter right to protest, but to the extent that it can infringe upon, say, Section 35 constitutional rights of Aboriginal peoples, namely for the Algonquins that are on this territory where they are recognized and affirmed, that there is a duty to ensure that peoples can't just necessarily occupy to the extent that that we couldn't practically enforce it. Like the formal recognition has to be met by effective compliance. So say convoy, for example, can pass through without being an undue burden on our Aboriginal rights as well. And we would hope that the federal crown would do what it can to uphold that partnership with us as the Algonquins. And so that would be a good discussion to begin things.
Thank you for your testimony. My time has expired, unfortunately, so I give the floor back to the chair. Thank you very much. Ms. Goudreau, up to 6 minutes for you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, in fact, the questions have been excellent, and they've really answered several of mine. And in fact, I really see this, and it will be written in our report. It will be non-negotiable when we talk about conciliation, amongst other things. It's very clear to me that conciliation comes through collaboration, communication, and partnership. And so we heard you very clearly. And I'm very pleased that you have been able to speak to us on this. I, unfortunately, do have some things that I don't understand. and I have trouble explaining it. When you talk about the concern about access, rights of access and mobility, you spoke about the building on Sparks and the concerns that an occupation might violate those rights. I would like for you to explain that to me better, because I think a lot of people are watching this. So I don't know who would like to speak, but you could both answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm happy to answer that. So the particular site that was negotiated with the Crown back in July 2019 for our presence there. So nevertheless, the entire region was settled where the three rivers met. So the Rideau River comes in, the Gatineau River, and Kitchissippi, which is the Ottawa River, and the sites around Parliament. So this has always been a site, and we still have unmodified and under the land claim that'll move forward. However, we still retain those Section 35 Aboriginal rights under the Constitution, and those aren't something that we could just go back to our homes if we happen to be Algonquin, that we say, well, we can't. We like it's site specific, so it's geographically specific in which we require access to. So, and also through our territory, no restrictions on our mobility to pass through certain sites. And it just so happens that what is now the downtown core and overlaps quite a bit with the parliamentary precinct is on those particular sites in which we have those agreements with the Crown to continually access. So we understand that there will be protests on a number of occasions. That happens on, even in the summertime on a daily basis, differing scales and magnitudes. But they're never so much that it interferes with our access to these particular sites where we might carry out our Section 35 rights. Now, we don't exercise Section 35 rights for, say, hunting in downtown core, for example, but we do for other ceremonial reasons and for gathering, for less formal political gathering, for deliberation amongst the nations and meeting places. So Victoria Island, although it's going to be closed off for about 10 years for remediations because of the ordinance that have been found in the underneath, I guess, the old tannery or what have you, the contaminations. That's something, a burden that we live with. However, it's not something imposed by other people that is transitory in nature. This, I think, the extent and length of the protest, which it evolved into an occupation quite quickly, puts a restriction on the Algonquin, which we still have the right to pass through here, and as well, eventually, for us to settle in just for temporary reasons, not for residential reasons, but in the site at 100 Wellington. As well as making our way across the city. Of course, we would have to be detoured through a number of streets and whatnot if we were to make our way through the Chaudière Bridge, if we wanted to go to Akikojuan. But other environmental and infrastructure reasons aren't quite the same nature and characteristics that are being put up by people of their own voluntary nature. So
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coburn. I think I have about 30 seconds left. I just wanted to ask the following question. Is my time up?
Vous voulez ajouter?
You wanted to add something? Please do.
Well, I just wanted to mention, Professor Colburn mentioned 100 Wellington Street, and that building has sat empty now for years, with 3 Director Generals responsible for this since I've become chief over the less than 3 years. And the willingness of the government is well known and acknowledged. However, how long will we have to wait to occupy the building promised to the Algonquin Nation if this means dealing with the same public servants focused on doing things right instead of doing the right thing? Anyways, just on that topic alone, just, the change of the jurisdiction and some activity that might be going on at the precinct, just to ensure that there's going to be no heavy-handed approach by presumably the RCMP if that's going to be their jurisdiction. So just the safety and, dignity of people that are occupying all the buildings there, because you obviously know in the past there's been some big issues regarding the police and Indigenous people.
Je tiens
I really want to mention and to tell you how important this meeting is, Madam Chair, because yes, we're learning, but we are clearly finding or seeing the importance of consultation. And really, our subject here is talking about security, but obviously there's the whole aspect of living together through the proposals that we've heard. So I invite the witnesses, Madam Chair, to perhaps have an idea of what we have received from the architect who came and met with us that might inspire some future consultations with this project. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Goudreau. Ms. Blaney, you have the floor.
And through you, of course, I'd like to thank the witnesses so much for attending today and for their important testimony, and hope that the members of this committee understand some of the specific things that were said about process. I really appreciate Chief Jocko sharing with us that if an Indigenous community is in one place and another Indigenous group comes, they don't do anything in that space until they talk to the first people of that territory. And obviously that process was clearly not done, and those protocols that across this country we understand were not done. So thank you for clarifying that. I think that was very important that that was on the record. So if I may, through you, Madam Chair, ask Chief Jocko, during the occupation, it is my understanding that her nation was informed by the Indigenous liaison in the Ottawa City Police and OPP during the occupation. And of course, if the precinct does change and there is an expansion of that, I'm wondering if that similar relationship is followed through with the Parliamentary Protective Services, and if that is not, if that's something that we would have to consider if we expanded the precinct.
Your question is to me, Madame?
Yes, it is.
Oh, yes. You're
you.
correct. I must say I was very impressed with the Ottawa City Police Liaison Officer, as well as the local detachment OPP, Killaloo. That's our closest serving OPP detachment. They were very, very good to inform me of all the activity that was taking place on the territory and within the city of Ottawa. And I would hope that the RCMP would have a similar liaison officer, who could keep in touch with us in a similar fashion. So that was very helpful. And I must say, I did feel that I knew exactly what was going on, especially pertaining to, the Indigenous activities that were going on in the city.
Thank you so much through you, Madam Chair. So if I could come back to you one more time, Chief Jocko. So if the parliamentary precinct was expanded, and that means that that region was overseen by the Parliamentary Protective Services, does that mean that you would like to see a very similar process where the discussions are there, where you're informed about different things that are happening, and it would be something similar to the experience you had during the occupation? If I could just get clarity so that we know what to put in the report.
Yes, I would like to make that very clear that I think it's very beneficial that we have that relationship. Of course, going forward, actually looking behind at the relationship we have now, like I mentioned, with the local OPP detachment in Killaloo, we are, we have a very good relationship, and as well as the City of Ottawa, we have a good relationship. And I know I've never met former Police Chief Slowly in person. We have corresponded on numerous occasions involving other significant events that have taken place within the city. So I do feel that, that relationship should be maintained going forward, and forming a new relationship with the new security force that will be taking over that jurisdiction, if in fact that's what's going to be happening.
Thank you for that. That's extremely helpful. I guess my next question, and maybe I'll start with the chief and then move on to you, Professor Coburn. But is there a clear process of communication with the Parliament and your nation? You talked about the ability to occupy the building here that is set aside for you in 100 Wellington, and that's still not happening. So I'm just wondering, is there a problem with the communication lines between the nation and Parliament, and is there work that we need to do there that would open up those communication lines?
Yes, I can confirm that there is a problem with communication that filters down to Pikwakanagan through the various departments. So if that could be improved directly to us, that would be greatly appreciated.
Is there anything you would like to add, Professor Coburn?
Yes, if you don't mind, just foreseeing some of the issues that would come up, and I think it would only be in very extenuating circumstances that ideally we'd like to have, I think, a liaison officer that would be not necessarily 100% devoted as part of their full-time equivalency, but to communicate with, say, Algonquin political authorities or what have you, is to have an arrangement. I know that this was a once-in-a-lifetime. Who knows how many more protests and occupations of this sort may ensue, but in the event that the parliamentary precinct is expanded, when there's times of crisis and Algonquins wish to move into the precinct during these times of crisis, that they're not met with resistance or force, that they're mistaken as protesters or occupiers themselves. They may say, please, we've made arrangements with through the liaison officer through our nation to go and visit, say, 100 Wellington Street during the upheaval that may hypothetically be underway in the future if this were to occur again. So, and not to be, I guess, arrested and mistaken as a protester. So, for example, they may schedule a site visit into the parliamentary precinct in a time to ensure safe travels in and out.
Well, thank you for that. I admit that I did check out your tweet site through you, Madam Chair, and one of the things that I found compelling was you were tweeting about comparing the teepee erection that was happening on the Hill in 2017 for 150-year celebration of Canada Day, and you talked about the clear distinction that you saw between that, where there were arrests and there was a lot of action from the RCMP to stop the actions that were happening, and the difference between when you wanted to put up a teepee and what happened with the trucker convoy. I'm just wondering if you wanted to speak to that and your concerns that if the precinct does in fact grow and expand, if that will still be an issue and how we could move forward to address that.
Yeah, so that's the situation that I would anticipate and would hope to avoid, because I was there on the evening of June, it was late June 28th, 29th, perhaps, I think it was, just in anticipation of July 1st, Canada Day, of erecting the ceremonial teepee for the 150th anniversary of Canada. And a number of us, not myself, but a number of us were detained by the RCMP and Parliamentary Protective Services. So they put up an ad hoc detention center because I guess they don't really have a jail cell, and they might have those particular authorities. So a number of individuals were arrested. It was hours of a standoff. And again, this was the peaceful participation in the matters, which were quite apart from the disposition of much of the trucker convoy. Not to restate everything, but I think Chief Jocko pointed out that there was individuals bearing signs of universal hate, like the swastika or what have you, whereas we were, and it was other Anishinaabe, just exercising what would be a Section 35 right. Again, we're not exercising hunting because we can't do that. We know there's reasonable restrictions on that particular right because they're not absolute under Section 35. But even the charter to protest or gather in public assembly, we weren't allowed to do that as well. So
Thank you.
they relented.
Thank you so much. So we're coming to the very end of our time, and we have 5 minutes to the Conservatives, followed by, I've asked, 4 minutes of the Liberals, and that will keep us on time and will bring us to the end of our time together. Mrs. Block, up to 5 minutes for you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you to our witnesses, I would like to thank you for joining us today. I have appreciated hearing your testimony. I do want to start off by recognizing that June is National Indigenous History Month, and given the comments that were made by Chief Jocko in regards to her own parents and their service to our country, today they were highlighting the contributions of well over 4,000 Indigenous peoples who served in the First World War and over 3,000 in the Second World War, with many decorated for bravery in action. So I want to just recognize that here today. I think, while we have a special committee that's already examining the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which has been referenced throughout the testimony that we've been hearing on the precinct study, we also have a long-term group that is reimagining changes to the precinct, and now we have this study before PROC. Your testimony, your comments highlight the complexities in regards to the motion which really initiated this study and the need for consultation, and which came upon the heels of the protest. And so I really only have one question for both of you. And I'm just wondering if you have any concerns over the invocation of the Emergencies Act that may well lead to it being more readily used in future events that could include Indigenous protesters, not unlike the protests that took place along the rail lines during the blockade of 2020.
I could begin. Certainly, and I don't represent everyone, but I know there's a plurality of viewpoints within Indigenous communities and amongst the Algonquin themselves. So I have relatives who supported the convoy as well, but eventually waned and were irritated by, I guess, the ongoing occupation. We're living in a time where people are very critical of government overstep. Indigenous peoples have always been critical of it because of the legitimacy of government to, it hasn't received our consent to be governed in many aspects. It's been assumed that's changing as well. So I do empathize with a lot of Indigenous peoples who think, well, we might be next. We would hope, and I believe that there might be enough balances that it might actually be checked. But as Indigenous peoples, we're also well aware that despite the judiciary putting a check on the executive when it carries out what it believes its own interpretation of the legislation is that the executive still ignores Supreme Court decisions. So we see in Wet'suwet'en territory, for example, is going back to the 1997 Delgamuukw decision, where they were recognized to have territorial title, and they've never modified that whatsoever. We still see, it's through the British Columbia province using the coercive powers of the state to remove them. So there's always that worry, I think, amongst many sectors of Indigenous peoples. So and there's, we're living in a time of a pandemic too. So there are different viewpoints and perspectives amongst Indigenous peoples, and just an anecdotal sample from my Facebook feed is there's differing perspectives on, say, vaccine mandates, for example, is can the government force me to do this? What will the government enforce or force me to do next? So they would like to have sufficient checks on the invocation of anything that they might perceive to be as infringing upon their freedoms themselves. So,
thank you very much.
I recognize that. Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you. Chief Jocko, do you have anything to add?
Well, not much more than obviously I can't, repeat what Professor Colburn has said, but just, there's obviously a balance in maintaining civil order. So there certainly has to be a balance there. And just thank you previously for your comments recognizing, Indigenous veterans, and that, includes all veterans of this country. Certainly appreciate those comments. And just a consideration, if we're changing things at the precinct, possibly a name change would be in order as well for that area. So just for throwing that into the equation for consideration.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Nappi.
To both Chief Jacko and Professor Coburn for presenting today. I live in Ottawa. I'm an immigrant to Canada, and I consider myself a settler. That's a conversation I often have with my two young children who were born here to make them understand our responsibility towards reconciliation. So I want to thank both of you for your leadership in educating people like myself. I also want to start by acknowledging something that Chief Jacko, you spoke about in your testimony around differential treatment by police when it comes to different kinds of protests. And you spoke about how Indigenous people and their protests are treated by police across the country, and I've seen that in my city here in Ottawa as well, and towards other racialized communities as well. And so there is a systemic challenge when it comes to law enforcement that we have to work towards, and so I do want to take the time to acknowledge that this is an important conversation to be had as well. In relation to the work that we're doing here in this committee around parliamentary precinct and what it means, I was wondering if you can help us your vision of what a parliamentary precinct should look like and means to the Algonquins, given that the Indigenous Peoples Place is located right across from Parliament Hill, from Centre Block in particular. And as plans are being developed to rebuild Block 2, which is on the south side of Wellington Street, adjacent to Indigenous Peoples Place, and hopefully more a parliamentary square in front of that space. What is, in your view, should be the vision, keeping in mind reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples, and of course, celebrating and understanding Indigenous culture and traditions as well? You, Chair.
Well, I guess I'll go first then, Belton. Well, I think I did mention before, I think that a name change would be in order for the parliamentary precinct. I actually had the opportunity to visit one of the last tours prior to the construction going on in the building, and it's quite an elaborate building, but it really is void of our host nation presence. There's really nothing to signify the Algonquin nation in the architectural design of the building. So I think, we could hopefully see those aspects incorporated into the refurbishment of the precinct itself.
I would add, just Mr. Yaki, just that I think a lot of what we might be looking for is the security and the enforcement of Indigenous rights through the particular space that's proposed to be the expansion of the parliamentary precinct. So our presence will always be within it. And I think Chief Jocko would agree is there's a special relationship between the Algonquin Nation and Canada itself is, and having the building right across from Parliament is right sort of in the heart, into the seat of federal power, that we're right next door to it. In terms of, say, the urban planning, I don't know if Ottawa seems to be quite good, and I don't think it does anything necessarily too offensive in any way whatsoever. We know that we're right across the street from Parliament. We can look through the window eventually when 100 Wellington is opened up. Again, somebody at the Department of Public Works or what have you is still dragging their feet.
Thank you. I would just, I think we're running out of time, and I was wondering if I can just ask a very quick question, and that is one of the things being considered is whether Wellington Street should be closed to vehicular traffic. I'm just wondering if you would be supportive of that.
I would be, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I wouldn't object to that either.
Excellent. Thank you on behalf of PROC committee members, I would like to, on behalf of PROC committee members, I would like to thank both of our guests for joining us today. If anything comes to mind, please do not hesitate to provide that in writing to the clerk so that all committee members can consider that. With that, I just want to give PROC committee members a heads up in regards to next week because we discussed the agenda in camera, so it's not really out there. June 6th, Monday, will be the deadline for C14 amendments as we will be considering that legislation. June 7th, we have sent out invitations to Professor Cardy, Professor Taillon, and PCO officials. The second hour of the June 7th meeting will be Minister LeBlanc, accompanied by PCO officials again. And then on the June 9th meeting, we will have the Operational Security of Parliament Precinct continue, the last meeting for that, followed by clause for C14 in the second hour. And I would ask that for June 9th, any edits to the version 3 of the code draft report be perhaps shared with all members so that the following week we can pencil that in following clause by clause, version 3 of the code. Following clause by clause for C14, that's the space we will enter into. And you have also received the draft report of the Indigenous Languages report, and I'll start some conversations as to when we can have some feedback on that so that we can set that into queue right following version 3 of the code report. And that should hopefully bring us into the summer season. With that, everyone, please keep well and safe. Thank you.